In the world to come, there is nothing but the pleasure of the relationship between the soul and God. And that, as in all relationship, depends on what you made it. Allegorical terms, we talk about being given a portion in the world to come. You're not given anything. What exists in the world to come is the natural state of the relationship between God and each soul, which in the world of choice made the choice of a greater relationship or lesser or no relationship. It's said in the name of Heinrich Heine, the German Jewish poet who converted to Christianity in the hope that he would make it in their society. On his deathbed, he said, "God will forgive me." That's his occupation. Again, it's a childish view. Forgive, of course. But the relationship between the soul of man and God depends on what you put into it, the same as any relationship here. You can't be given a friendship, you can only have it offered. It exists to the extent you reciprocate. The whole concept of mitzvot, 613 mitzvot that God created for man, is God saying to man, look, I created 248 positive vessels for the receiving of that which creates a relationship between man and God. Each one of those mitzvot that you do creates a connection between your soul and me. There are another 365 commandments that are negative commandments, in which God is saying that to do that will break the relationship. And God says, don't do those. Do these positive things that establish the relationship between your soul and me. Don't do these negative things that break the relationship. And now that I've told you this, you act, you make the choices. Because unless you have the ability to make those choices, then there's no possibility of relationship. The third point, which we learn from relationships, is that in the relationship between any two beings, the more alike you are, the more you're going to relate. Picture a person having a warm and intimate relationship with a table and chair. You can have more of a relationship with a dog or a cat because we're more like dogs and cats than we are like tables and chairs. But even there, it's not quite like us. You can have a greater relationship, more in common with a human being. And even among human beings, it depends what you share. Now, people will point out to you that isn't it true that in relationships you have to have complementary nature? Like in a relationship between a man and a woman, they bring different strengths? Of course. The complementary nature is the strength of your personality. But no one would say that it would be a great relationship if a very good person married a very evil person. It would be a horrible relationship. In terms of values, what is the goal of life? You need similarity. Once you have a similar goal, then you bring different strengths as to how each one of you can help you get to that goal. Relationship between two beings, the more they are similar, the more they could relate. So, can you tell me what I know about God that can tell me what I should develop within myself to be like God? Giving. In other words, I know that if God is infinite and yet I exist, His nature is infinite giving. And therefore, the more of a giver I become, the more like God I can be. You see, we've now switched around the desire for getting pleasure of taking by the fact that you connect to God by becoming like Him, and that's by being a giver. The most positive catch-22 you could ever hear of. The more of a giver you become, the more like God you become, and the more pleasure you'll get out of it. What are the stories about Abraham? Does anybody know what character trait characterizes Abraham more than anything? Hospitality, generosity. He sets up a tent in the desert, 4 doors, giving people food, clothing, and shelter. Because the more giving he becomes, the more like God he becomes. And the more like God we become, the more connection you can have to Him. You see the full circle now? Your goal is to get pleasure. You want to get pleasure. The greatest way to get it is to attach to God, and the greatest way you attach to God is by being a giver. The more of a giver you become, the more you get out of life. And don't think that's so strange, because that too exists in every relationship that human beings have. Your first motivation to have friends is to not be alone, to have friends for your own good. If you enter into a relationship based on your need for relationship, and in the relationship you focus on the need of the other and they focus on your needs, then the relationship is furthered and it grows. And then you get more than you would ever expect back, which was the original reason you got into it, your need for relationship. But if when you get into a friendship, you're aimed at getting your good and they're aimed at getting theirs, then there's no friendship, no relationship, and it collapses. And you get nothing from it. You have a need, but if what you focus on is the need, you'll never get anything out of it. If you focus on the need of the other, then you get out of it what first motivated you to get in. Similar interesting story was told, a Hasidic Rebbe, Rabbi Motty Berger. One day he took his disciples out to the square, and they were having a fair going on. And along with selling all the merchandise, there were people entertaining. You know, they pass a hat and they do entertaining. One guy had a wire strung up across the main square, and he'd pass around a hat, and when it was filled with money, he'd walk across. He did a high wire act with no net in those days. And the rabbi took his disciples to watch the high wire act. And afterwards, when they wondered why he did that, he said to them, "Tell me, why did that man walk across the wire?" And they said to him, very simple, he does it for a living. He collects money for that. And the rabbi said, yes, he collects money for that, but you can be sure that when he was on that wire, the money was the last thing he was thinking of. Motivation to get into a relationship is what you need. But if that's what you focus on, you don't get it. Abraham becomes the giver par excellence. Giving food, clothing, and shelter, because the more like God we become, the more we're going to get out of it. But now let's go one step higher. What is the greatest thing that God can give a human being? Greater than life. Connection to God. If I, Abraham, know that, then I can become just like God. What else was Abraham known for besides giving food and clothing and shelter? The first missionary, marching around, explaining to the world, showing them how there's one God who created you for your own good, and the greatest good you could do is connect Him. Why does Abraham go around teaching the world? Because he says, if the greatest thing God can give a human being is connection to God, then the greatest thing I, Abraham, can give my fellow human beings is the knowledge of how to get that connection. I, by teaching people, end up giving them the same thing God is giving them. Aha! Now we have the father of the Jewish people. Not because he knows there's one God. Anybody should be able to figure that out. It's because he drew the logical conclusions. Infinite God means we are created for our pleasure. How do we achieve that? Not only what is the highest goal, how do we not let anything else get in the way? How do we achieve all of it? Through what God gave us to know about relationships. We have to be able to choose it. We're given some pleasures that head one way, some that head the other way. The relationship between me and God depends entirely upon me reciprocating what He's giving me. And to whatever extent I do it, it exists. And the more I become like God, the greater my relationship to Him. It's at that point that God establishes His direct revelations to Abraham in terms of prophecy and making the covenant with him.